I'm very pleased here to introduce our wonderful, what I call the academic dean. There's probably another title, but that was the title I've heard over many schools. So she's the one who not only keeps us in order, which is a serious job already, as many of you know, but she also sets kind of the tone and the culture of the school and how we proceed about our work, both in the classroom and in our offices or in the field. I'm not going to talk long because we're running a little bit behind, but I'd like to say, Gita, thanks so much for coming today and opening up the conference for us.
Thank you, Bruce. I think Bruce just put on my shoulders the hardest job there is, which is to set and maintain culture and a set of norms. And as we all know, because we're all here today, that's really difficult to do. I thought what I'd do in about 5 minutes is give you a sense of organizational culture from a faculty perspective at a university. And as you see here, it says the big question, can my organization, company, or university change? But if you look at what you have on your desk, it puts universities first. And maybe that's because universities are uniquely hard to change as much as organizations and companies are, if not more. So let me step back a little bit and talk about why this conference is so timely. So we all know that change is hard. It's hard to embrace innovation, hard to make changes in the way we do things. However, there is so much imperative for change. We must change. So that's the dilemma, is given we must change, even more so today, given the changing environment, how do we go about doing it? So let me give one example from Columbia Business School. For a long time, and I've been there 21 years, we've talked a lot about interdisciplinary work. We've talked about faculty talking to each other across boundaries. We have different divisions, management, marketing, accounting, finance, and so on. And we've talked a lot about faculty speaking to each other across these divisions, doing research together, and teaching together. Because we really do believe, and I think the evidence shows that that kind of interdisciplinary work leads to really unique insights, and the sum being greater than just the sum of the parts. So how do we make that happen? So when I first came here, even if faculty across different divisions met on the elevator, they often didn't know who the other person was, because every division is separated by space. So each division's on a different floor. People tended to interact with people on their own floor. So in the last few years, I do notice a culture shift. I won't take the credit for it, because I think a lot of what's happened is environmentally, there's been this momentum for change. Other schools are doing it, other universities are doing it. So therefore, people buy into the idea that we must do it too. That's one. The second thing is some kinds of incentives for faculty to work across boundaries. And I'm a psychologist, not an economist, so I don't believe incentives always work. But in this case, with the rightly structured incentives, we do see some movement so that people are teaching across boundaries and teaching and doing research across boundaries. The other thing that's happened is just gentle nudges that have moved us in the right direction. And one of these is the creation of Space, which is a new faculty lounge where we have a lot of light, and it's a beautiful space. There's an espresso machine, and these little things make a difference. So people hang out there, people talk to each other, and we see a lot more informal interaction, which is really the goal. Because the minute you mandate culture change or mandate things, it's not going to be successful. So as a result of these informal conversations, what we are seeing is a lot more discussions and a lot more breakdown of these divisional boundaries. So I won't say we've gotten there yet, but I think there's been a great culture shift and things are moving in the right direction. So let me also take a little time to talk about some research that I'm doing with my collaborators and my doctoral students. And I'm a marketing professor. So what we are interested in is changing people's habits and changing their acceptance of innovative new products. And what we find is desire for control, which is an individual difference or a personality trait, matters. In the sense that people who have a higher desire for control are less likely to embrace change. So what we are trying to do in our research is try to come up with interventions that can help people who tend to resist change to actually embrace it. And our work is more in the consumer domain, but I think it's equally applicable in the domain of changing employee behavior or changing organizations. So I'll stop there with my overall remarks. I am curious to hear what other people have experienced and done, so I'm looking forward to hearing and being present during the rest of this conference. I also want to take the opportunity to really thank Bruce Kogut, Damon Phillips, and Sandra Navali for putting together this fantastic conference. So thank you for coming, everyone. Welcome, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Damon Phillips. I am one of the people who's been working on this, but actually this is something where Bruce came to me over the summer and had this idea that he and the others in the Bernstein Center had been really seriously thinking about. And when they came to me with the idea, I thought it was great. Really happy to be part of it. And really excited about today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take about 10 minutes and frame the day for us, build off of some of what Gita was saying. So by the way, Gita, it is amazing what free espresso and some comfortable chairs will do to break down silos. So a fairly efficient way of tackling that problem, I'd have to sort of my experience. So, but what I'm going to do is frame the day, get us kicked off, and hopefully not heavy ground rules, but a bit to help us really get the most out of this conversation today. And I do hope it can be a conversation. So let me sort of. So I'm going to begin by the kind of story that many of you have heard. And there's often these stories about how people miss the opportunity to change. And there are various analogies that people use. And this is the Titanic. And you may have heard the Titanic used as a metaphor in this particular way. And in this sort of story, you have here Captain Smith, who knew a few days or a few hours before that there was going to be potentially some ice. And he made some slight changes, but not serious changes. And he then, a bit before they actually hit the iceberg, he retired to his quarters to get some sleep and said, "Call me if there's a problem." As you know, they called him. So on the other side is a guy, his name is Jack Phillips, and unfortunately I share his last name because he's given a lot of the blame for it as well. So he was what's called the wireless operator, and he's the guy that sort of communicates from the ship to the rest of the world. And you have these families and these passengers on the ship, and they send messages, and to him, he passes them on to New York or London, wherever they may be, and he retrieves messages. He's a customer service guy. Well, it turns out that other ships in that area were sending him messages saying, "There's a lot of ice here," or things like, "We have stopped. We cannot sort of deal with this ice." And his response was, "Please shut up. I'm trying to get through this stack." Because, again, he's a customer service guy, right? So he's trying to go through this, and that was dealing with that emergency was the second priority, right? So there are a lot of these stories about the opportunity to change, and then it doesn't happen. But I'm gonna think that today that's only going to be a small part of our conversation. So it turns out that when you ask people who are leaders or those responsible for change, most people say, "No, we know change needs to happen." And I think most people in this room are not going to be shocked by the possibility that things need to change. That's not going to be the key motivation, at least for a lot of us in this room. That's not going to be the key issue. And so when people are polled in various polls, you get sort of these responses. Like in this case, companies, about 600 companies or so, about 70% of the people said that they expect there to be some change in the next 2 years. So it's such a short-term type of window. So that's not so much of the issue. It's part of it, but it turns out that the problem is that change is hard, as Gita mentioned. And there's a lot of ways of dividing up why it's hard, but right now our motivating question is can my company or organization or university change, but just should it change? And again, that's a motivational issue, and I expect that some of our conversation is going to deal with that motivational issue. Can I change? The sort of the meaty question here. And then the third is, will we change? So maybe we have the capability to change, we have all the right resources, but can we convert that to actual transformation? And I think a lot of the discussion today will help us in that following way, because change, usually, especially big change, statistically does not work out well often, right? And more than 50%, and time and often up to 2/3 of the time, depending on the type of change, it's not going to work out well. So given that it doesn't work out well, and we know that it's hard, we're hoping that today can be a great time to have a conversation around that. So I'll give you a quick example in my case. So I wrote this book on the market for jazz music, and it's not the sort of book where you go to jazz clubs and listen to. I was more interested in the record companies. And it turns out that in their case, they were responding to the large record companies in the 1920s were responding to changes in the market that they themselves created, right? So they initiated this innovation of recording jazz music, completely altered the market, and they had to respond to it, and many of them were not successful in that. So it was a unique type of organizational change moment where they actually initiated the change and found it difficult to actually deal with the consequences of the changes that they created. So if you go and you read books about the problems with organizational change, it sort of lists these kinds of things: ineffective sponsorship, inefficient resources to change, communication problems, or resistance from stakeholders. Employees or sometimes customers can be resistant to the change. And that's sort of a common thing, and I expect some of that to come out today, and I hope it's done so richly. But we also know that there are people in this room who have really experienced all kinds of really fantastic change, positive change. So changes in culture, structure, capabilities have been found to change. People have been in organizations where the level of innovativeness has changed in a radical way, and we want to be able to have a dialogue where we can really appreciate that richness and learn from one another. Now, and again, I want to sort of say, if you sort of go to the textbook on org change, these org change processes, these would be some of the things that you would commonly see. We deal with active and visible leadership, effective communication, a change process that's structured and disciplined, appropriate use of resources, and having some level of employee participation. And that's all good, but that's always also easier said than done. And I think most of us in this room have seen some list that looks like this, and we're good with that, right? But we all know that it's easier said than done. This is just a reminder for me that I would have been happy if this was the outcome when I first tried to do archery, right? I read about it, and I got up, and it turns out that's really hard to do. It's really hard to get past sort of going from reading about archery and actually hitting the target. Still never made the target. The way I want to sort of frame that is we want to hopefully have a conversation that takes us from the what to do to the how. And hopefully go back and forth between those, learning lessons of what happened in one context and then bringing it into, well, so how did that happen? What were the tactics that allowed that to happen? And I think we can do that. And I'm very excited about today because we have a particular formula. And what was great about the idea when they brought it to me, that it's bringing together people who are consultants who have seen a wide range of different types of changes and what works and what doesn't work and how it might vary by industry. Academics who have done a lot of research on these core principles of human behavior that relate to change, and then people who are actually leading the different change efforts, and bring us all into the same room and have a great symposium. Give you a sense of just a slice of the diversity that we have. This is just the organizations represented by the people formally on the panel. And we have This is, again, what really excites me about today. I've already met a few people in the audience. If I had 10 more seconds, I could put some more logos on there. That's fantastic. We're hoping that the day reflects this richness that we have here. So with that, hopefully you have a sense of how we hope the day will go. I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker and then get out of the way. and take out my notepad and start taking notes and learning from the different insights that you have. So, so Duane Bray is with IDEO, and from most of you know that it sort of began as this fantastic product design company that expanded to many other services and products. Duane Bray is the head of global talent, leading the firm's strategy around people and culture, and that involves everything around career development, mentoring, recruiting, building the internal and external networks. Before doing this, he was at IDEO for 16 years before this point, and here he was doing a lot of the design work, client lead, and heading up different business groups within IDEO. Now that's sort of the formal. I had this fantastic phone conversation, and I was so charged after that conversation, hearing about what he's going to talk about today and the launches to this day, that I hope you can sort of see. Let's go ahead and get into it. I'm going to get out of the way and again open up my notepad, and let's have a great conversation today. Thank you. Welcome.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. Can you hear me okay? I'll drop this. I'm a little shorter. Thanks so much for inviting me to come today. Really happy to come here to talk to you a little bit about some of the things that I'm seeing around change, both in the corporate world, which IDEO spends a lot of time in, but also in the education world. So I thought maybe I'd just call this Quest for Innovation, because it's what we hear a lot of times from our clients. How do we seek to be more innovative? What are some of the things that are happening in the world that might impact us? And I thought maybe for folks who don't know us well, I'd set some context. If there are sort of 5 things to maybe know about us or about the lens I'm trying to bring to the table today, I'll bring that to you. One is this idea that design is being seen as a vehicle for change within organizations, and sort of a vehicle for innovation. We didn't claim this, but we started to have conversations with the business audience about the way that designers solve problems is actually more broadly applicable. So there are certain things that we do. Design thinking is the sort of the way we talk about it. That has to do with empathy, gaining insights, storytelling, iteration, prototyping, and seeing that there are values, applying that not just as designers, as craftspeople in doing what they do, but in everyday people solving problems in that way. So that's how we got onto this journey about design thinking and its role in innovation. The second thing is that we take a particular lens in the work that we do, which is we have a lot of people who have a lot of different backgrounds. We don't necessarily claim to bring the expertise to the table that our clients do, which may be around a technology, or it may be around a business need. So there are things like viability, feasibility, and desirability. Obviously, a great product service experience, anything is at the intersection of all of those. The role that we try to take is the human lens, so representing people and their needs and what is driving them and their behaviors, not dissimilar to the marketing conversation we had in the opening remarks, understanding those needs and motivations. So that's the hat, as you hear me talk, that I'm going to be trying to wear moving forward. The other thing is that for us, one of the things is that the world is becoming increasingly complex. So how do we design for the world that we live in? And we've tried to position ourselves in different places where we intersect with different cultures and try to bring those together. In most of our offices, you'll find people who have either done a tour of duty or transferred from some other part of the world. They may be doing a temporary working on a project. We had a team from our office in Mumbai camped out with us for 3 weeks. And this cultural cross-pollination we found to be incredibly rich for us, because it's hard to imagine that complex solutions today sort of fit one very narrow target. The other thing that we've talked about, I know as part of the opening conversation, is sort of the role of disciplines, multidisciplinary work. And we believe that we put our teams together start to finish working in a cross-disciplinary way. It's rare that we'd have folks that work in just one capability. People are blended, and it's everything from, we started with just a broad general set of design and engineering capabilities, and we now have very specialized experts who may be in education. We have a food scientist because we do more work in food and beverage. So you bring these folks together, and one of the things there is the process that you structure around that allows these people with very different backgrounds to come in and actually work together in one room together to solve problems. Finally, I think similarly, the industry cross-pollination has been important to us because the learnings from one industry often adapt really well to another. So I'll give an example in the world of service design. We do a lot of work in retail and hospitality. One of the things you find is there are certain aspects of those clients, how they train folks around being good customer service folks that translate really well, for example, to financial services or to healthcare, where the notion of customer interaction, there's been a need for some more work to be done there. The other thing I thought I would just mention for today is a lot of my client work is actually in education, K through 12 and higher ed. So we have a bit of a knowledge there. So I'm going to try to give more of my examples later from the world of education than from the client world. A quick overview just to give you some context. And I thought I would just share as we look out at the landscape of our clients and what our clients are telling us. And one of the things I like about being at IDEO is that we work across so many clients and industries that you start to hear things bubble up again and again. So these are three things which may be obvious, but they're things that are on a lot of our clients' minds. So I thought I would share those. One of those is that innovation is no longer seen as a nice to have. And there's this interesting thing that we know that a lot of our clients are increasingly aware of, which is that if you're a big company with a big brand, it's no longer guaranteed that you're going to be around for a long time. So this notion that 50 years ago you could imagine being part of the S&P 500 for about 50 years, that's declining to more like 15 years. So there's no guarantee. And so one of the things our clients are thinking about is the notion of responding and adapting or anticipating change is becoming increasingly important for them because they're quite aware that this is a shift that they're seeing in the world. The second is that the expectations around leadership and leadership attributes seem to be shifting. So people might be familiar with the IBM Global CEO study they did a while back, and one of the things that they were asking CEOs to identify is what are some of the key attributes or characteristics of leadership that are important. And what was interesting is that creativity emerged as the top one. And so this notion that creativity isn't anymore for people who have the word creative in their title, but actually the ability, creativity as a notion of being able to adapt to change, come up with solutions, evolve beyond your core skill set is becoming very important. And the third one is that there are new tools and processes that make it really easy for competitors to come in and disrupt. And we certainly know that in this little slide of the MakerBot here. But what's interesting is again and again how surprising it can be to some companies to see that happen. A great example of an interesting one is Weight Watchers, which is a company that's been around for a long time, very established brand, very large customer base. You can imagine sort of looking at the landscape of who are the other companies that are offering weight loss programs and where are they coming from and what are their offerings. Well, over here in the corner are 99-cent weight loss apps that anybody can download on their phones. And while they may not all be great, they may not give good advice, they're very accessible. And so what they're finding is that more and more folks are actually moving away from some of the larger weight loss programs to this for 99 cents, I can do something to track my diet in my pocket. And seeing this notion of it's so easy to use platforms today to get that out there, the notion of going from prototype to real product, the steps are way lower. I mean, it used to be, I sort of a dinosaur back in the day of interaction design where we had to do these long specification documents back in the day. Now a designer coming in can build a coded working prototype in an afternoon and it's basically as good as the real thing. So this notion of our speed by which we can make things tangible and real in the world is increasingly faster, which means if you have a great idea, you have an easy platform to get that out there. So I thought I would also just share, because I've been doing work with a lot of universities around the US in various capacities, and some of the challenges we're hearing as patterns in higher ed aren't that different. I'm curious to see with your lens on this how much you agree or disagree with these. But one of those is interesting about, again, this notion of disruptors being able to come in and try to take advantage of perceived shifts in learning styles. This is especially true in K through 12, where digital and multimodal learning is meaning that it's difficult to imagine for some of the established players understanding exactly how to kind of prototype or innovate there. So we're seeing companies that are coming in and experimenting with ways to do that, whether that's direct to schools or often being able to bypass directly to teachers or to parents to think about new ways to establish themselves and take advantage of new ways of learning. Or the discrepancy often between teachers who are familiar with technology and some of the systems that they're using, or students not understanding the difference between their day-to-day lives and what they're finding in the classroom. The second one is this idea of students being prepared over time. So again, what's been interesting is conversations. I'll give one example in a moment, where it's not necessarily a given that you're going to work with the same company, right, for the rest of your lives. It's not necessarily clear that your industry is going to be around in the same form in 20 or 30 years' time. So how do you actually prepare yourself to adapt to changes as an individual? And people are starting to ask that question of, what does that mean? So I got a major in this thing and I know these skills, but do I have the additional skills around that, that if that goes away, or if I need to do something else, that I actually have the ability to do it? The third is, I think, sort of a sense that we're dealing with, both research and out in the sort of the corporate world, the notion of pressure to try to move beyond silos. So we're seeing interesting mashups and combinations, particularly within the sciences, and you already see within universities enabling ways for that to happen, but also expectations on the part of employers about people coming into the workforce that actually have a bit more of an empathy or breadth. As a term, I think McKinsey coined it, called T-shaped people. So this idea of, I have a depth of specialization in one thing, but I have empathy or at least some awareness across, which means if I step in the room and work with somebody else who doesn't have my background, we have some way to find common ground, as opposed to I-shaped people who may be really good at one thing, but if you met them at a dinner party or a cocktail party, you'd have a hard time getting them onto another topic. So thinking about this sort of pressure to think about moving beyond silos, already heard that this morning. The other is a really interesting one that I've seen come up from a lot of students in different universities where we've had connections, which is seeking to apply learning outside the context of the classroom. Real-world tangible application. I'll give some examples of some universities that have worked on trying to find ways to do that and try to build more of a purpose around that. But the sense of, if I can't actualize it or try it in the real world, it may not be the right sort of learning frame. May not be the things that I want to be focused on. So how do we think about that, and are there opportunities for us to address that? So I thought what I would do is, rather than give a bunch of corporate examples and do the translation, I would give examples in higher ed where I've had some direct connection to at least have some knowledge of what's going on. I thought I would just, in the earlier conversations we were playing this, I'm going to do a little sprinkling of some different examples that some you might have heard of, some you may never have heard of. And I think the first one I just thought would be fun, because I think they're actually an amazing school, is Stevenson University, which, has anyone ever heard of Stevenson University? It's a small commuter school. Look, one person, oh my God, that's one more than I expected. Small commuter school outside of Boston. They evolved over time. A few years ago, they got a president whose name was Kevin Manning. He had an interest in, he has a real passion. This school often recruits from a local base of kids who might not otherwise get into college. So what they're trying to do is actually support them with skills to get them out in the job market. And Dr. Manning had this belief that it was going to be really challenging for students in the fields he was imagining them going into, based on the companies they had relationships with, to stay competitive in their field for a long time, that things would be shifting over time for them. And so one of the things that they worked on was orienting. So this is an interesting example of top-down and bottom-up, meaning Stevenson is a non-tenured school, so you can come in as a university president and make some declarations and actually get some traction. So I'll put that out there. That's a difference. It's sort of the power of top-down works really well when there's no tenure. But what he had to do is figure out, how do I align with faculty and administrators around the reason why we're doing this, or why we believe this. So it actually started with this purpose or mission statement, which I think you can read, and I'll have to turn my head to actually read it because I can't see the screen that well. But so there's a larger sort of promise on the right, which is the promise to meet our students where they are, wherever they are. We promise that through delivering personal direction, professional know-how, and discipline expertise, we'll empower our students to map their vision of the future and hit the ground running as they embark on their journey. We promise to empower our students to take unexpected turns, create new paths, and change destinations while they're out on the road. So they're almost setting an expectation that you will be evolving what you do over the course of your life. And so these sort of the way they saw their education was primarily delivering discipline expertise, which is choose your major. And so they said, how can we supplement this with two other things, which are also important? So one of those is professional know-how. And it's interesting, they teach classes on how to interview, presentation skills, what to wear to an interview. I mean, they're very, very basic, obvious skills, but it's about actually teaching people orientation of acting as a professional in the workplace. And then this other piece, which I think was fascinating, is this notion of personal know-how, which is almost life coaching in a way, understanding myself, my core strengths, my traits as a way in, so that if things change for me down the road, or even actually if I decide, I thought going in this was what I wanted my major to be, oops, you know what, I hate this. Who'd have thought that biology involves so much math, for example? So perhaps they have the ability to start to think about how they retool then and there. One of the things that was interesting is this sort of model, and it's a little hard to read, so don't worry, and I can share it with folks afterwards who are interested. But what I thought was interesting was defining these specific ways in which they delivered each of those things, which is that they impart for their students traits, skills, and tools across each of these. And then they do this through the intersection of theory, practice, and relationships. And so this idea of across all of these, how do you position any effort that they're doing? So where does a job fair show up in this? They had an interesting thing that they've done, which is that as you're building your transcript, each class imparts a certain set of skills. So your transcript has a sort of world-facing view, which is it builds your resume. So as you're going through and taking classes, your resume is basically being constructed as a student. So looking at ways that you can actually think about putting in activities. So part of this is then auditing. They could audit across everything that they're doing to see where are their gaps or weaknesses, and then also looking at that across the 4-year student journey and looking at particularly those moments of transition. So one of those is just what does it mean to get ready for school? The other is what does it mean to start to move into my major? And then there's actually another one that they've started to take responsibility for, which is what does it mean to transition out of school and into the workforce? So thinking about that same lens of activities across those 3 areas, looking at how that fits across a 4-year student journey. So thinking about building a platform there. So with a combination of a mission and a sort of model, having conversations with each of the different academic departments about ways that those things show up. What does the university provide as a holistic group that all students have access to? What happens at the individual department level to round these out? So I just thought it was an interesting example to share. They've got a few white papers they've been working on to document this if people are interested to hear more. The second was a little closer to home, which is NYU's Center for Urban Science and Progress. And what I thought was interesting about this, we've been doing some work with them as one of their consulting partners, but they are one of the schools that responded to the mayor's challenge around having more of a focus on technology and the sciences in universities in New York City. And what I thought was interesting was actually just a couple things. One is the time frame by which they were able to actually go from IDEO to having a set of 35 graduate students taking classes in a building, which was 2 years. So meeting with them in fall of 2011 when, here's an idea. We think that there's an opportunity for a domain that's around urban sciences. It's kind of loosely out there in the world, but we think we could maybe define it a little more closely in partnership with some other universities. So again, let's come together and define what we think the definition of this is or what it means. Let's get partners on board. Let's sort of understand how a curriculum kind of flows out of that. And they moved really quickly. So basically convened a group of people in early 2012, second convening in the spring to build out the curriculum, submitted it by the summer, acquired a building, worked on aligning faculty, building out some of the needs, and launching this past fall with a group of students with a pretty ambitious goal within 5 years of 30 postdocs, 50 senior researchers, 100 PhD candidates, 430 master's students, and 150,000 square feet in Brooklyn. And one of the things, there are two things I thought were interesting around this is, one is they also started with the notion of a bit of a mission statement to define what this discipline or field was. And it ended up being an interesting paragraph that circulated in a lot of places because it was convenient to bring people on board, to rally folks around it, to reach out to potential students, to understand the differences between maybe what this program was focused on versus existing programs at NYU. The other thing I thought was interesting is they took this sort of startup approach, which is, we're going to operate as a lean entity. We're not going to follow all the rules. We're going to kind of live out here. We're not even in Manhattan, right? So it's in Brooklyn, so we can sort of, no one can see over here that far, so what can we do? The other thing was really interesting is that they also then leveraged the core. So they recognized that they had a deep core within NYU and all these different partner universities. So, okay, here's a full curriculum. We have faculty that we brought in to teach this, but we have gaps. Well, NYU actually could probably fill a lot of those gaps, and then they found these partner institutions doing that. So using this idea of going out to the edges, pushing, building a startup, but knowing that you have a pretty tight umbilical cord back to one deep core institution here in the city and several other large institutions, actually more than one in the city, and then multiple others around the world. So this idea of saying you can leverage scale once you have a definition around what you're doing. So they kind of ran lean and mean at first and then kind of brought in the capabilities as they needed to move forward. The other one I thought I would give as an example is I thought it's really focused on this notion of learning happening outside the context of the classroom. Applied learning was Harvard iLab, which folks may be familiar with. If you're not, it's sort of loosely connected with the business school, but it's actually cross-university. And it's a physical space with programming around it, which is primarily focused on helping student entrepreneurs actually build and launch businesses in the world. Students apply, student teams apply to come in from pretty much any of the schools within Harvard. They have about 60 to 70 at a time. These are the examples there. You do that above and beyond your normal coursework. It's not for credit. They have a curriculum and programming and advisors that are around supporting that. But what was interesting is they did the same sort of lean approach, which is we think there's a big idea here. We see this coming from our students, the need and the desire to actually apply their learning in the context of tangible things. In this case, encouraging a sort of a venturing spirit of bringing things out into the world. Let's just get a building, not quite, get started, haven't quite figured out all the leadership, hadn't figured out all the planning, and we'll learn as we go along. So that was kind of part of the start, is operating in a fairly lean and nimble way. Again, it helps to kind of be somewhat isolated in a different space. They've experimented with some interesting things. One of those is having one of the floors that's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as simply a gathering place for people to come together, to bring their ideas, to share, to work. Expanding this notion of student success to you can stay after graduation for about a year as an alum and continue to work on your idea. Bringing in more industry partnerships. What's also been fascinating is how many companies have expressed an interest in actually sending their own teams to the iLab to say, well, perhaps if this is this magical environment where innovation can happen, we can kind of actually send our own teams into the iLab to work there. So that's one of the things that's been interesting, is seeing, is there something about the notion of a dedicated physical space with a sort of an environment and a set of programming around it that's enabling this to happen, right? That it's part of the university, but it's also carved off. And these are just some of the key schools that are currently have teams running the iLab. But there's an opportunity perhaps to think about this notion of incubating an environment where you can allow these things to happen, that people kind of sign up, volunteer, come in. Seeing the way that they've scaled the number of student teams, I think has been quite impressive. So that's another example I thought which was interesting about sort of being nimble and starting out starting out small, but growing around a very clear purpose, which is applied learning in the real world, literally through launching businesses. Another one, people probably know the Stanford D School well. Full disclosure, if you don't know this, our founder, David Kelly, is also the founder of the D School. There are a lot of case studies about the D School, but I think there are a couple of things I thought would be interesting to share, maybe from an IDEO perspective on this. One is actually, I will say, similar to the other two examples, rough, ready prototyping, being willing to just operate as a startup and work. The D School started as a double-wide trailer, right, with a vinyl sign hung on the outside. This guy, Hasso Plattner, founder of SAP, donated $35 million for a building. You can imagine at the opening party when it's a double-wide trailer with a vinyl side, he's like, where's my money going? Because certainly didn't go into this building. They now have a historic building on the quad. But they started small, again, lean. But again, sort of their model is interesting, which is that you don't get a degree from the D School. You don't spend all your time there. You come in from other disciplines or other fields, and you do a tour of duty, a set of classes within the D School, and then you bring that learning back in. So this structure is built primarily around breaking down silos and causing disciplines to work together, have conversations together who would not otherwise do so. So the idea of it may be that I'm in my building doing my thing, focusing, but when I come to the D School, I'm encountering people who are not like me. And that's a big part of the learning. The other is actually this idea of creative confidence, which I mentioned earlier, which is this notion of how do I start to have the willingness to put myself out there, be bold, make experiments. So they've made some very deliberate ways they've sort of gone about trying to do that, including these small interventions that are open to people. So they have these things, these pop-up classes, which are interesting, really short bursts that kind of have crazy subjects around them. They're imparting skills, but they're doing it, though, in a way that's somewhat playful. I mean, hence the banana. So they have things like design thinking from an artist perspective. They have all these different classes which are not sort of at the core, but they're about actually challenging people's beliefs, moving them outside of the notion of general requirements, getting them to think differently. They have these D-School boot camps, which are deep immersive experiences where things like time pressure, forced collaboration, things like that, it sounds terrible, but actually what it does is that causes you to stop second guessing yourself. So one of the goals is don't self-edit, don't second guess before your idea comes out there, learn to be a bit more vulnerable. So there's a lot that's going on outside of this broader context, which are traits that help people navigate this and work more effectively in a multidisciplinary way, but maybe more importantly, have a willingness to kind of put themselves out there. There are some interesting, again, businesses that have launched from there, so they have an opportunity to sort of incubate new ideas. So students do projects. It's in the context of coursework, which is maybe different from the iLab, but they result in projects that can be taken further. So there are some examples, a startup that's pretty successful around K through 12 learning motion math. I think people may or may not know about the case study around the Embrace baby warmer, which is a low-cost way to actually provide warming capabilities for babies in places where power and things may be difficult to get to. And then there's the Pulse News app, which was kind of an early out-of-the-gate news aggregator that hit some popularity for a while, although the New York Times didn't like it so much. Oops, I just went to sleep. Hello? Please talk amongst yourselves while we figure out what happened to the screen. Laptop went to sleep. Does it not have battery? Fortunately, I didn't have very many slides left, so I can probably riff off of this if I need to. I don't know, just did it not come in? If anyone needs coffee, this might be an opportunity. So perhaps, actually, I was going to just give some, at the end of this, some recommendations on things that we might be able to, just some principles to think about. But maybe while we're figuring out the screen, I could just say, are there any questions about what I've put up so far? Yes, in the back, yes. That's a great question. And actually, I would say I think there is an awful lot of similarity there. So one of the things that's interesting is how you start. So I'll give Procter & Gamble as an example, large company trying to find a way to build, so innovation, but what they tried to do is actually be a bit more specific about what they meant by innovation. So things like faster turnaround time to market. So from idea to in market. A better way to explore consumer insights and turning them into ideas for products. So they built this thing called the Procter & Gamble Gym, which was, again, not dissimilar to the D School or anything else. It was a physical space. It was separate from their other spaces. So, in the corporate, in that context, it's masses and masses of cube farms. And so it was a hard time finding any collaborative space. So building a space which was actually set up for teams to come in and work. So it was designed around teamwork in a way that their existing spaces were not. It's hard to commandeer a conference room for 6 weeks or something while you're exploring a product idea. So it contained all of the physical space, but also a definition of what teamwork looked like. So coming together with a team. Should I step to the side? Would that help if I can take?
You can take this. Give me 1 minute.
No worries. All right, there we go. Except I'm blinded by the blue light. So I'll stand over on this side, maybe. So the idea was create a context which is about collaborative teamwork, start to finish. So early marketing insights all the way through to manufacturing and thinking about that. Anytime there was a sort of a viable idea initially, they would actually take the team out of whatever building they were in, move them to the gym, and actually run them through a process of building out the ideas and testing, getting consumer insights, et cetera. So one of the things they found is that they were able, with their first trial product, to go from idea to manufactured product within, it was within 6 months. And their fastest time before then had been 18 months. So it was just an interesting measure there. So I think one of the things when you take established, so I think actually Procter & Gamble, iLab, others are examples where you have very established legacy thinking, a lot of reasons why things happen the way they do. It's almost like breaking out is one of the ways that change can happen. I'll give a corporate example of that in a minute too. But that was a great question. I can give more on that too. Any other questions while we're waiting? Yes, please. Yeah, it's really interesting because one of the things that you often hear, I mean, particularly when we come in and we talk about helping our clients with change, they say, well, we tried that before and it didn't work. And it's like, well, do you know why it didn't work? Because it could be like, if you understand the why, right, that's where the learning comes in, which is it, because I think one of the things is often failure is just, it didn't work. It's a shame. And more like, it didn't work for these reasons. And if you understand why, it's like, well, then we can actually move off of that. So one of the things we try to do when we come in, because that's, I would say, guarantee almost every time we come in with a new client, it's we tried those things and it didn't work out. And so what we say is, let's unpack the learnings behind those and say, if you start to turn it from it's a bad thing to it's a learning opportunity, the other thing we'll do often with our clients is we'll take them through intentional iterative prototyping where things have to fail because they're early on. And part of that is redefining what a prototype is. For a lot of clients, our prototype often means something that they've put a huge amount of money, time, and emotional investment in, so that when someone says, that doesn't really work for me, they're like, what are the most minimal things that we can do to tweak this to make the person say they like it, rather than saying, maybe we can throw that out and try all over again. So it's those kind of rougher experiences that sometimes help. The other is really putting the emphasis away from the notion of failure to the notion of learning. So those two working together can often help. Let me wrap these up, but we can keep going on to questions. Back in business, great. All right, thank you. I will do that. I had an online university example just because I thought people would be like and throwing things at me if I put online learning up here. So I thought that was just it for fun to see what people say. But So there's an interesting one, Capella University. We've done work with them, so again, disclosure, that's why I know something about what they're doing. But one of the things I thought was really interesting was this idea of learning how to reach students where they are from a recruitment and a retention perspective, which may be particularly a challenge for an online university where people can drop off and disappear. But one of the things that happened with Capella, maybe I'll back up before I throw text up on the screen, is that they have relied on a lot of sort of third-party aggregators that basically, you may be familiar with this model. When people are doing Google searches, they can kind of intercept and say, well, here's maybe as we can vet a candidate. What they found is that probably 70% of those leads were not good, right? So the amount of investment in getting an aggregator to push potential students at them was not actually aligned with what they needed. And we said, well, rather than spending the money on that, perhaps you might be able to turn your own existing recruiters and staff into folks who can actually bring that information in. So started this thing again. I mean, this is back to this sort of, I mean, this is kind of the corporate and higher ed example of hard to do things in the context of where everything lives now. We threw up this sort of labs website, which was an experiment in storytelling and outreach that they could safely do because it wasn't the core offering over here on their website. So one of the things was actually just experimenting with things like understanding how they could tell better stories about their own students and their experiences, a way to help others self-identify who might want to be there. So building narratives around that. A second one was trying to actually understand or compress down the snippets of what the learning value was in some key areas so people could almost try it on for size in a very, very short amount of time. But probably more importantly was actually having all of their sort of staff and recruiters start to build an online presence. So building, using Facebook as a vehicle for outreach, both for people who might be interested in Capella, but also as a way to have an ongoing conversation for career counselors when people might be second-guessing themselves. There's some key moments, particularly in doing an online degree, where you can see some real drop-offs. And so if you're aware of that and you have counselors who are embedded in social media, there are ways that they can actually anticipate and look out for that. Similarly, using Twitter as a vehicle for doing that as a way to reach out. So one of the things they found is they were able to do is actually do most of their acquisition of new students through their own people without relying on outside sources. The other is that their counselors were able to intercept challenges or questions far sooner than if the student had to proactively go to the website and actually sort of push a button or push a feature to say that there was something that was going on for them, or you notice a drop off and you have to reach out. So this idea of staying connected because this is where their students were, and trying to build a platform around acknowledging that and building sort of the mechanisms around that, around especially key behaviors where they noticed that they would have some challenges. So I had sort of 6 working principles. We'll kind of, and then we can dive into some questions if we have time. How am I doing on time? Okay, all right, then I'll move through this. So one of those, I use some examples up here, but I think whenever we've done, I don't know how many folks here sort of look at or do assessments around change management, but a lot of change programs, I'd say the majority fail. And I think one of the reasons why is actually a lack of alignment around the purpose. So what is our organization's purpose, and how do we build a set of things around that? So this diagram is a model that we use often, which is purpose and vision at the center. And we call it customer facing, because a lot of times this is a corporate client, but you can imagine it's student facing, but it also could be faculty facing for that matter, which then results in things that you might have to consider. So space, I've talked a lot about space actually and the role that it's played as a bit of a signal. I've talked the sort of roles that can come out of that that are important. Leadership attributes, the ways that you define what innovation looks like. So I mentioned with Procter & Gamble and the gym, right? You can say loosely we want to innovate, but what actually is that in service of? What is the thing that we're going to measure as a result? In their case, it's faster time from idea to market. So innovation should be grounded in something. You also should start to see new behaviors as a result of that. So it may be that we're going from a state of being entirely siloed to being one where people are more collaborative, or we're going from the notion of all ideas being top down to being ideas being more emergent. And then you can also start to identify around that what are some of the core values you think the organization has, or needs that are necessary to sort of act upon that purpose. So that's one thing we talk about with all of our clients when there's change is let's orient it around a purpose, then let's also identify the things that we want to measure if we're trying to create change. The second is, I think, this notion of both emergent and directive working together around change. We found that purely top-down doesn't work that well, but also we've had so many instances when people have come to us that are not at the top of the pyramid of their company and they want to create change, but the leadership isn't interested or doesn't believe that that type of change is actually what's right for the organization. It's not going to go very far. So we look at this. This is what we're calling sort of emergent cycle, which is the idea of how ideas are actually synthesized into bigger patterns or themes that the organization might need as a whole. So how do you evaluate, for example, if I'm an employee who wants to suggest an idea or a change, how do I align it with a theme or principle that the organization needs so I know that it's actually in line? So thinking about how top-down and bottom-up can actually work together. That Stevenson example I think was interesting. Without the faculty and administrators being able to build out the model, each of those models and the ideas that occupied them, they wouldn't accept necessarily, I guess at risk of being fired, but they wouldn't accept necessarily the change that was being proposed to them. So finding the ways that people fill in the gaps from either direction. The other is I was really surprised with a lot of our clients how infrequently they experience anything from the perspective of whoever they define their end user to be. And you could actually take Columbia as an example and say, what's a student lens on it versus a faculty lens, and making sure you understand that. We do a lot of work in patient care, and it's surprising how few people experience their hospital or facility the way their patients do. And we often do some very deep interventions that are around that. With one of our clients, we even had them meet us in the patient waiting room for the meeting, and we were 45 minutes late because we wanted them to, like, this is an empathy moment for you about this is what people experience every day when they come into your facility. They've never even gone in through that door before. So this notion of let's build a lens on our institution, our company from an end user perspective and see how they see us. Identifying areas where you can be agile. Sometimes it helps to start with change away from the core. This is another example maybe to your question. It's a PNC Bank, and one of the things they wanted to do is experiment with financial tools that would work specifically for Gen Y customers. This was probably 5 years ago when everyone was trying to figure out what Gen Y folks were doing on anything. And one of the things here was around breaking down the barriers around financial products. So the notion of, a checking account as a product, a savings account as a product, a money market account as a product. And a lot of folks, particularly in Gen Y were like, I don't understand why these things have to be discrete. So this was the notion of one account that has what's called a reserve. And a way to look at what money you have available versus what's scheduled to go out versus what you're saving for with goals. There was no way they would be able to do this experiment by making all these changes to their online banking site. So they built a parallel microsite that launched, and they gave it a product name, which is mobile wallet, and they drove people, or virtual wallet, sorry, and they drove people to use that when they signed up, particularly when they put out a marketing campaign that was directed at millennials. Then what they're able to do is say, well, if this works and people use it, we can actually integrate it into our core online banking. But it was a way to start without, because it was still an idea, and it had been proven in user testing, but that wasn't the same as launching it live in the world. There was a chance to avoid some risk while actually getting this out there live and learning from it. Another one was build to think, and maybe this also goes to learning from failure thing, like once you have an idea, test it out and learn from it. And we've done some things with our clients, this is an old example, but I still love it, where they've been horrified that we've done like end user testing sometimes with basically a post-it on a device that maps out a screen. There are a couple interesting things that happen with this. One is, you can actually give the person you're talking to a pen and say, mark up the things that don't work for you. They don't think it's precious when they see this. And also, we haven't invested any emotional effort or even a lot of time into this. So if it turns out it's a bad idea, you put the Post-it in the recycling bin and you start over again. So this idea of intentionally creating situations where failure will happen and saying that that is a learning moment, and intentionally being really rough to say that the reason we're able to do this and move on is that we haven't invested too much, and that's sort of the value of iteration that comes as a result of that. And finally, I think this idea of, with a lot of our clients, is thinking about the sort of the full stakeholder map. to understand who really needs to be engaged, who needs to buy in here, and making sure we're not missing anyone along the way. And sort of this is just a sample, sort of 2x2 of looking at kind of thinking about change management from an inside to outside perspective, and also from an individual to a broader cultural perspective. So just some thoughts to leave you with, and maybe I'll switch over or switch back to questions if we have time for maybe a couple more before we run out of time. Is that good? Anyone? Well, thank you. Thank you. So, question there in the back.
Care about design. I mean, it's either an afterthought or even an impediment sometimes. So how important is making it look sexy, ultimately?
That's a great question. You're asking a designer who works at a design firm, so I'd probably say very. But that's my bias. I hear what you're saying, and I think actually what is important is enough fidelity to communicate the essence so someone can understand it. And that doesn't have to be design. Like, we've done a lot of work. So you mentioned you work in healthcare, right? So we've done a lot of work. Let's say one example of a big client of ours was Kaiser out on the West Coast, and looking at nurses as a vehicle for change within a hospital environment, and giving them a simple set of tools to test out ideas, which was basically a bunch of surfaces painted with whiteboard paint where they could sketch ideas in patient rooms or in other places, an evaluation system for patients and visitors to sort of give feedback. But a lot of it had to do with things like an experiment with, can I reach a nurse when I need to? And that actually might just be, we're going to use text messaging as a vehicle for that rather than paging as an example, right? So that doesn't have to be designed. And actually even the evaluation of thumbs up, thumbs down, would be one. We had an interesting one where we had a group of nurses that did have a whiteboard in a patient room, and it just was able, where they could actually say, who is the team looking after you? So you know their names and their roles. And then it became a place for family members to draw like pictures and stuff for them. But that was not well designed at all. But what worked is that the intent was really clear. So I wake up, I look, I see who my team is. I see I'm expecting next this person. Didn't have to look great. So, but yeah, we tend to put a little bit of polish on stuff. But that's just us. Another question in the back there.
I've got good enough voice. Oh, well, maybe not. Jumping off of what this person was saying, do you think that design can have like an environmental psychological effect that most people just don't value until they see it and experience it?
Absolutely. I mean, we use that with our clients all the time when we're doing workshops or things. We'll often create immersive experiences for them. So, for example, we might do something with a client, we're trying to immerse them in their brand, and we'll create an environment or a context for that. I mean, there's certain cases where it becomes incredibly important because you may be trying to express an idea to a customer where actually the brand that it's coming from or the way that it's expressed is really important. So, I mean, a lot of work that we do, particularly smartphone work, where there are subtle nuances in behaviors, those have to be designed really carefully. And actually, one of the things you can test for is the difference between how does this behavior make someone able to complete a task or feel good about the experience versus this. So there definitely is a place and time where that becomes important. So, absolutely. And just being deliberate about that. And I think there's a big difference sometimes between either, like, again, it's what are we trying to learn, right? So it's asking that question and then saying what degree of fidelity is necessary. And in some cases, a sketch on a Post-it is fine if we're trying to understand if they grok the idea. The other is like, can they do something that's very nuanced? We probably have to get to a pretty high level of fidelity. I saw there's a question there, and then one in the back. Oh, yeah, and names, please, yes.
Hi, Duane. I'm Nancy DeVinny from IBM,
Hi.
and I thought your comments are really great. And I have a question because many corporations, including IBM, were very interested in how to accelerate change. So would you say that good design work in the process can accelerate change for organizations? And do you actually measure how much faster change can take place if good design work is done?
So that's a great question. And what I would say is there are places where I think good design can help. So I'd say in some cases, like the Procter & Gamble example or iLab, whatever, that wasn't actually about design. That was actually about extracting something somewhat from the mothership in a way to test out the idea and put it back. Where I think sometimes for us design comes in as a really powerful tool is actually in the communication. So stakeholder alignment, understanding what the value proposition of what we're doing. If we're trying to build tools, if we believe that the tools are valid and right, they need a bit of a weight to them, which means the consideration of how they're expressed matters, right? Because I'm going to receive this as a solid, well-thought idea if it looks one way versus not. So one of the things is how declarative are we as an organization about these things, and then let's match the fidelity to that. And then again, I think where we would always put a lot of the effort around accelerating that is in the communication. And that can send a really clear signal. We're ready, we're behind this. That even has to do with, it's obviously the writing as well, who's sponsoring, if it's coming from the leadership. Those things actually get out there and they can spread like wildfire. So we're pretty deliberate about with really complex projects, we often have this there's an experience phase of the product service thing we're designing. There's often a business or operational model piece, and then there's actually a communication phase, right? Or it's sort of thread that all three need to work together, but the communication piece is actually where a lot of that effort goes in. So one question in the back, and then I'm probably out of time.
Okay. Good morning. Gil Valdez. I'm a second year here at the business school. And my question was about one of the common threads that seemed to go through all of your innovation examples was, you termed it tour of duty or some sort of time limit on the exposure. And so I had two questions about that. One is in terms of what is the key element of that, in terms of is it the sense of urgency it creates? Is it that people don't settle? Is it the new energy? And then the second part is, how do you create that when you can't rotate out? So if you think about university administration and how sometimes those positions are really set for years and years, how do you create that?
That's a great question. I could probably pull that into, there are two pieces to that that I can sort of pull out. So one of those is the role of time, and the other is the role of place and rotation. So we find that rotations can be helpful if we want to, I guess I'd say, teach people to have a certain level of mastery and then kind of go back as advocates within their organization. So the Procter & Gamble gym example was a model of taking people out with an idea that they would bring it back in. There are a lot of other particular companies that will build some sort of kind of innovation space with the hopes that that feeds back in. Sometimes that can be helpful. I have to say, you have to be, the bigger mothership has to be ready to receive that, because we see an awful lot of, I'm not going to get any change, and people actually leave. So there's a retention risk sometimes with that strategy if you don't have the means to put that forward. The time is a slightly different thing. We find that using compressed time frame actually forces conversations to happen that could languish otherwise. And so we will, with our own projects, we set very aggressive time frames because our clients actually have to build a decision-making mechanism that's aligned with that to move forward. So you're agreeing that we're going to do this over 12 weeks. That means decisions look like this. In the ideation phase, that extreme time compression helps, again, because all of you can't do all the, let me think it through in my head, let me self-edit, let me go away and do my own research, and then I'm just a me over here in the corner, and I'm ignoring the kind of we of the teamwork. So those are just forcing functions sometimes to get the behaviors we want to see. They don't always become as critical over time, but even for ourselves, just within our own working groups, we often use tight time frame just as a way to force us to get things done faster and sooner. Can we squeeze in one last question? I saw one more hand, and then that's probably it.
You just mentioned decision making, and can you comment on the correlation between the decision-making culture and ability to change, and in both directions, having people who are not used to making decisions, making them, and in reverse, letting people who usually make decisions, letting others make those changes. Yeah. I think that culture, in order to have change, you have to change the decision-making culture.
That's a great point, a really good point to probably dig into a bit more later as well. I think you're right. One of the things is sometimes the monolithic, massive group of people in the room, you just can't make an effective decision. We sometimes ask our clients to set up advisory boards you keep informed, and then there's a decision-making team, and they're not the same thing. That definitely helps. Cool, I think we're out of time. Thank you so much. It was really fun to come talk to you.